Hello, I'm Kimball Wilson. I am an artist and the founder of Corporate to Canvas, where I provide company team building events through painting activities. I'm joined today by my friend Nikki Aharts, who is the owner of Snap Savvy Strategies. And I know her through her business. It's branding, it's about profitability. She'll tell you about that. But what we're talking about today is trauma as it relates to team building. So Nikki, I'm going to pass things over to you. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Nikki Aharts with Snap Savvy Strategies, and you're right. Normally my company is in branding and pricing and profitability consulting and business growth strategies. But previous to this life in entrepreneurship, I actually had over a decade of experience working in trauma. I was a sexual assault response team victims advocate in San Diego County. I did that for 6 years, and then I actually transitioned from there and worked with foster care teens that were going to time out in the system. They were never going to go home. They were going to turn 18 and be out in the world without any parental support at that point. And so I had to prep them. And as you can imagine, kids that have had their parental rights terminated from their parents have a very long history of trauma in their background. So I have 10 years of trauma. I always wondered what the background in trauma would have anything to do with my entrepreneurial life.
And exactly leading into my first question here is define what trauma is and an example of how this applies to the professional realm. I mean, among teams.
So as it relates to who you're working with your population, they're mostly going to be looking at their stakeholders, their employees, their management team, their vendors, those types of things. What was working before, unfortunately, is not working anymore. The way we thought behavior, the way we think people behave has completely changed. So things have become highly unpredictable. We can't guess how somebody's going to work. There's been a huge disruption in work relations and workflow because we have people working from home, and are they coming back, and are part of them not coming back because our kids are out of school, and are, so some are coming back, some aren't. The challenge that's uniquely facing corporations in this environment is, how do we pull the team together and create the right flow again that's going to keep the efficiencies up, keep the sick time down, eventually or essentially create resiliency within the teams. So when a trauma occurs, usually in a disaster, people come rushing in from the outside who are not a part of the traumatic event to support and build up those who are involved in the traumatic event. Case in point, 9/11. So even though the whole country was affected by 9/11, you really had an acute group of people who were majorly affected by it in New York City and the Pentagon, and then the plane crash in Pennsylvania. And you had outside teams come in. Same thing with Katrina, same thing with, hurricanes, tornadoes. Usually you have a highly traumatic event, outside people come in to support the traumatized people, and then it kind of goes from there. Unfortunately, we're experiencing a collective trauma, and it's not isolated. So no one actually can step in who is not in fact traumatized by what happened, because the entire world has been affected by that. Now, to certain degrees, obviously some states and more rural areas are not as highly affected as, the denser populations, because this is a disease of density. But when you layer on top of that, what happened with George Floyd and the protests and the uproar that has come from that, I think there's very little population in the United States that hasn't been affected by one or both of these traumas. So really we have to look at the fact that most people in a stressor environment are familiar with fight and flight. Okay, that's what they always say, your fight or flight response. But they forget that there's a third component, which is freeze, which is if I hold and I play perfectly still and I don't move, maybe I won't get hurt. What we're seeing in our fellow citizens and the workforce is this constant fluctuation between, rapid cycling between all these three different elements. So you're seeing this combative fight response, and then you see them freeze, and then you actually see them daydream and then fall asleep and want to sleep a lot. That's the flight response. So you've got all these different responses. How do you pull it all together? how do you meet them where they're at and have a conversation? And one of the things that I love about what you do, Kimball, is that you use art. And a very long history working in trauma, I can tell you one of the first things we went to with anyone who was suffering from a trauma was to art therapy. Art therapy. So the key with this, there was a study done in 2016 that really showed how the activation of art caused a 75% decrease in cortisol levels in the body and in the brain, which you know, or most people hopefully know, that cortisol levels have to do with the stress hormone in the body. So if we can decrease that chemical response, we can come out of that fight, flight, or fright or freeze moment and refocus on stabilization, which, you know, coming out of that trauma reaction into a more stabilized normalcy. So painting can be highly effective in doing that on a lot of levels. So the art plays a role on a lot of levels. So one is the decrease of cortisol in the bloodstream. The other one is something that came out in 2015 is when the book started coming out about it, which is something known as gamification. It's a model that has proven to be very, very effective in team building and finding flow between team members and between departments. Is this notion of creating a game and applying game elements to an environment such as work that wouldn't normally have games in it. So painting also allows for a gamification element to come in, which we know is highly effective in team building. So you get the double benefit of gamification as well as decreased stress. So pull those together, and it's a really effective tool right now for helping corporations stabilize their workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's funny, I see both aspects as I'm actually working in the field, if you will. You know, I'm not an art therapist, but I have worked with, you know, a couple thousand people, and I see that progression throughout the class itself. So, you know, you come in, it's a little intimidating to look at the blank white canvas. Then they get into the zone, they get into that flow, and they're focused on the artwork, they're doing the painting very precise, or, you know, whatever their style is, and they're not worried about what's happening back in the office or, you know, what's going on at home, because your focus is like, it's a meditative focus on the artwork. And to your point with the gamification, I also do some activities where the group may be switching around, there may be some competition involved, and everybody wants to really step up and be a part of that team to create something amazing. So it's really interesting from, like, you explaining from more of an expert scientific standpoint, and here I've seen it live and in person, but just haven't put the name tags on it yet. So,
and it's a really good example of what we're all dealing with right now. Certainty is not big in our vocabulary right now, because we literally can't predict where we're going to be in 6 months. We don't know what our universe is going to look like. We don't know what our personal and greater world is going to look like. And so certainty is a commodity. And one of the things that you talked about is that freeze motion that occurs when they look at a white canvas, because they don't know what it's supposed to look like at the end, where they are going. And so it's a really great metaphor for helping people on a micro level work through the fact that, okay, it's a blank canvas. What are we going to do with it? We're just going to start painting. And if we make a mistake, then that's part of the art. The other thing is that with painting, it's a highly visual modality. So part of the stress and trauma response that you hear when people talk about PTSD is that they talk about that movie of that trauma occurring over and over and over again in their heads. They have that audio visual response that's coded that seems to be stuck on repeat. What's amazing is when they engage all three of those systems, the audio, the visual, and the tactile, it prevents them from getting stuck in that negative loop that's going on in their head of all the horrible things that happened or could happen, because they're having to deal with what's right in front of them. So it makes for a really tactile, concrete way to interrupt that trauma response.
Yeah, so as far as team building activities. I mean, we've spoken about we've spoken about the painting. What are some things that maybe we want to take a back seat on as we're coming back and bringing the groups together?
So one of the things we want to look at from the emotional state is to not overwhelm anyone right now with any overload of stimulus. The other thing is, the notion of just keeping conflict really, really low. So the gamification element of what we do, we want to keep the competition relatively low key, right?
Yes.
We don't want it to be highly visceral in that sense, just because they're going to be easily triggered. For right now, it's probably going to be smarter to keep things relatively small. And one of the great things why I love about your program is you can do it remotely. So you absolutely can allow the people who can be together in that smaller groupings, because I believe businesses are also being expected to keep the social distancing up. It allows them to have some group physically together, but you actually can pull your team members that are still at home for safety reasons, for medical reasons, or because of children or other extenuating circumstances, and you can still team build, which you don't really get a lot of. Like, you can't really go laser tagging, you can't really go run an obstacle course because you're touching each other, right? Painting is something that you don't have a high contact with each other over. So yeah, want to avoid a lot of the touching and the closer than 6 feet.
Yes, definitely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Do you have any parting thoughts, if you will, on the trauma response as it relates to team building? I think we covered a lot.
We did. I would say that whatever you think is going to happen, be prepared for the person to respond differently than predicted, and just have a lot of empathy and compassion right now on meeting people where they're at. Because they're not going to be necessarily behaving normally. And getting back into art is a really great way to practice creative problem solving and other things like that in a really non-stressful, non-outcome related way. So I would say just everybody practice a lot of kindness and empathy right now, and a lot of active listening, to what your team members need from you.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Nikki.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.